All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the third episode of season two of This, That, and the Other. My name is Varun Chandramohan, your host for today. Just to give you an intro about This, That, and the Other, it's a series that tackles some of the biggest and most debated topics that both managers and employees encounter in their professional and personal lives on a daily basis. Last week, we spoke about longevity and whether it was down to genetics or choice. The week before, we spoke about the pursuit of happiness, if it was an actual possibility or a fool's dream. This week, we return to our roots and we're going to be talking about a topic that is frankly not spoken about enough: bias in the workplace, and especially when personal life choices collide with your professional life. So here to shed some light on this topic is our panel. First up, she's a certified diversity practitioner and an expert in inclusive leadership, organizational change, and corporate activism. She currently serves as the Global Diversity and Inclusion Lead at Pfizer. Alvin Tremolay is here with us today. Hello, Alvin. Nice to have you on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, the pleasure is ours. And my second guest is a doctor, author, screenwriter, speaker, and an executive producer at Plum Talk Productions. Dr. Shelley Plum is here with us today. Hello, Dr. Shelley. Thank you for joining us.
Well, hello, Varun. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, the pleasure is ours, Dr. Shelley. All right, so in the best interest of our audience, I want to start off our conversation by asking my panel about bias itself. And I'd like to start with you, Dr. Shelley. What is bias for you, and why do we need to know about it?
Well, knowing about bias and educating ourselves on bias is really very important, especially when it comes to talking about equality. And what is bias to me? Well, bias to me is something that's actually multidimensional, meaning bias is when we think of ourselves as separate from another human being. That's the first dimension. Another dimension is bias is sometimes looking down on other people. And you know what? It's really, in a nutshell, bias to me is the absence of liberty. And I know that sounds very strange, but I came across a quote actually by, I believe it was Frances Wright, and she says, equality is the soul of liberty. There is, in fact, no liberty without it. So
Right.
bias, the bias is the absence of liberty.
Oh, that's nicely put. That's actually the first time I've heard that. That's fantastic. Alvin, any thoughts on bias and why we need to know about it?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just going to echo what Dr. Shelley just said about, something I will add is that bias for me are like presumptions that we make on certain things or on certain people. And most of the time, those presumptions are unconscious. So we will presume certain things on people, on what they are able to do or how they are able to do certain things. Those presumptions, of course, are not, proven by facts, but it's just like we think certain things which are not necessarily true. And some of the decisions that we're going to make after those presumptions are not, many of the time are wrong because we are taking the wrong way only because we have those bias.
Right, Alvin. And so I want to ask my panel, where does it come from? Where do we form our biases? Is it our environment? Is it within us? Is it our families? Um, how do we become so biased, or is it evolutionary, or is it ingrained in our system? Any thoughts on that? This is open to the panel, so.
Yeah, so definitely, what I used to say is that we are a product of a culture, we are a product of an education, we are a product of a family environment. There are many things that when we are children, there are many things that we hear unconsciously around, family dinner, around family lunches, that we are just going to, and even on media, of course, media have a critical role here to play. Sometimes we just sit and listen to news.
Yeah.
Without knowing it, when you're going to switch off the TV, something that you heard on an example that I want to take personally is the first time I went to, you know, to Romania here in Europe. It was the very first time that I went there. Because it was the first time for me to go in Romania, I kept having in mind certain image about Romanian, and those images were related to what I saw here in Paris about Romanian. It doesn't mean that all Romanian are like that, but
Right.
my brain brought me there. And it's also because I'm a D&I practitioner that I had to stop my brain, like, do not go there. It's not because you saw 2 or 3 people in a street in Paris that you're just going to generalize a whole country and a whole culture of people only with 3 people that you saw in Paris. So that's an example that I wanted to give, as a bias that we have, because we saw something once, we heard something once, and we just tend to generalize, which is not a good thing to do. This is really the opposite of what to do.
You know what, Alvin, I can echo what you're saying, and I agree. And that's an incredible story. And, bias too, I don't think that we're born with bias. I really do not think that we're born with bias. As children, I remember myself as a child being very open to especially as a young child, being open to, different races and different, every male, female was really for me the same. And, in studying other people and studying the biases that are out there, it's almost like as time marches on in our lives, we're exposed to sometimes toxic circumstances and negative people and people talking to us. And like you mentioned, Alvin, is the media and what we're exposed to now in the digital age. Yes, I mean, that really plays a huge role in, knowing that maybe we can do something about it. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And in many companies where there are conversations around, there are even trainings. Even personally, I don't like the word training, because for me, when you talk about bias, it's really a dialogue. It's because for me, it's about exploring those unconscious things with other people. There's one thing to know that you're biased, and then the thing after is, what do I do when I know that I'm biased? Because just the fact to know that I'm biased is not going to help me in the workplace or everywhere else. Is now that I know that I have a bias towards certain things, towards certain situation, what should I do moving forward? And in the workplace, for example, is about how, when I attract, when I recruit, when I promote, when I develop talents internally, this is where basically when I have to take, strategic decisions in the workplace, this is where I really need to be aware of my bias. And when I'm aware of my bias, take some actions, at least to reduce those bias.
That's a very good point. And Dr. Shelley and Alvin, how would you go about teaching people how to spot themselves falling prey to a bias, or how do you recognize or catch yourself that you are being biased? Is that can you be trained? Is it reading? Is it is are there any proven methods to to sort of obtain that skill?
You know what? That's an interesting question, Varun, and I think too that it's really individual. So, works for some people. I think may not work necessarily for the next person, but I can tell you as a general rule, for me, I can tell you for myself is, anything that comes out as resistance in my heart, if I am saying something and it is just not setting with me right, that's a cue that I really need to look within myself and really explore, what I'm saying. Or if I see a colleague of mine treating someone the same way, is to, if that's not setting with me, we have to really take a good hard look at that. And if we're looking at companies, for example, I think that adversity training and bias recognition type of training should be part of a company's culture, and so that type of training is looked at as a strength within a company. So that's what I think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can also echo on what you just said about the type of training, it's sometimes when people are asking me about things I am able to do in my company, what I used to tell them is, yes, I can tell you what I do in my company, but you might maybe not do the same in your company because your level of the level of maturity of your company is not that yet, and the culture, the values of your company, and on those topic of related to diversity and inclusion, leaders really set the tone. And if the tone of your company, if your leaders tone is not clear yet related to those topic related diversity and inclusion, it's not a training that is really going to make a difference. There should really be a culture promoting those kind of discussions and those kind of dialogue related to at least unconscious bias, as we call them.
I agree. And you know what? I mean, and with that culture, I love that term culture because it's such a positive term. With that culture, having the foundation be something that's simple, something that people can follow, having compassion be the groundstone or the foundation, and kindness. I think that and treating people the way that we want to be treated, as ingraining that in the culture in a company.
Oh, absolutely. Let me ask you a question about training though, and I'd actually made a little note wanting to bring this up later on in the show, and we can talk about it now because since you're on the topic of training, we've read about unconscious bias programs, exactly like what Alvin said, and then we read a lot about individuals being sent through cultural sensitivity training and all these trainings that as a result of probably an incident that happened at the workplace or during duty and so on. My question is, do these trainings work? And have you seen them work? Have you seen the kind of statistics behind them? Have you seen changes in your own employees or the people in your lives who have gone through the training? Do they work? And if so, what needs to be done in order to make sure these programs are very effective? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, of course, for me, as I said earlier, yeah, we run such, since 4 years, at least at the European level, we are working with a company that is really specialized in, microaggressions, micro incivilities, really on unconscious bias, and they are business psychologists. So
right,
it helps a lot because they have data, they have researchers on the topic, so they are not only coming to to support us on that journey, but and together, before running such a workshop or such a dialogue, depending on how you're going to call it, you need to set your own objectives on, okay, what do I expect from those conversations? What do I expect from those trainings? Because if you just run a workshop for the sake of running a workshop without knowing what you want to get from that, you might not get, effective results. So you need to be strategic, right? In really setting the objectives in advance of doing such a trainings, 1, 2, or 3, so that okay, from those discussion, from those workshops, these are the 3 things I really want to get out of it. If not, you're just going to have people around, you will discuss, and then people will go in their day-to-day job. The idea is really, I'm going to enable those workshops internally for this or that reasons, and this is how I'm going to measure what I do. And of course, the measurement are most of the time in our, internal company surveys, and like the inclusion index, we have a couple of questions on, okay, we had these conversations on unconscious bias. This is how we see a difference from since we had that internally. So that's what I will say about that. It's really about setting clear objectives and measuring,
Yeah, I agree with Alvin. I mean, clear objectives are essential. I think they're 100% essential. And the other thing is the objectives have to be comprehensive, because as we all know, there is different types of bias that is out there. There's of course race, there's gender, there's age, there's similarity bias, there's something called the horn halo effect. So there is so many different types of bias. And the first step is educating people, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. There are many types of bias, and something to also know that there are conditions which under which bias are thriving, like when you're under pressure, when you're, the overall impression you will have on something or on someone, the effects of drugs and alcohol, when you're tired, um, a high cognitive load, of course, and when you're under, when you need to reach out to a closure on a certain project. So those are some examples under which bias thrives as well.
Right, right. And I have a I think an interesting question. I hope it's interesting. Does politically or does political correctness interfere in these programs? Like, does that happen?
Of course, it happened. That's a good question, and but I think something to also coming back to the culture, as we said earlier, is about the level of psychological safety in your company, because if people feel safe enough to express themselves,
Right.
then you will really have genuine and authentic discussions on those topics. However, if the psychological safety is not there, then people will
Right.
just be, they're not going to be themselves. And this is a very good question, because when people are not themselves, that definitely the outcomes are not going to be,
Yeah.
the one you expect. And yeah.
Yeah. Dr. Shelley, any thoughts on
You know what?
political?
Yeah, and I mean, just echoing, what Alvin said. I mean,
Yeah.
that's so incredibly important. And with any training, I mean, employees are not going to speak up. They're not going to speak their opinion. They're not, unless they feel safe, unless they feel like their opinion is valued. So, going back to the idea of the culture within a company and combating the bias, it's essential that you communication being a foundation. You communicate with the employees, even giving surveys and questionnaires, and encourage them to having team meetings where we get together. That's what we do with our company, with our production company, is we have team meetings, and at the team meetings, they're encouraged to speak their mind, and it's a safe place to do that. So it's essential.
Oh. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm on board uh, with the both of you. Let me also ask about the cancel culture, because we've seen, I mean individuals fall prey for fall prey for bias and so on. But does this whole cancel culture affect the way these programs are run, and do they hide actual biases in the workplace and out there? Does it suppress it? Um, um, do you agree with that? Disagree with that? Or do you feel it has a role to play?
Sorry, Varun, I didn't hear your question well. Sorry.
Oh,
I,
right.
I, I
No,
didn't hear
no,
it well either. Sorry.
oh, my bad. No, that's fine. So I was asking about the cancel culture, right? So this is something that has been increasingly seen. Like every time somebody has a slip up or somebody has a bias, the steps taken or rather the steps taken in public tend to be very, very drastic. Either they get fired, they get moved, or they get sent off, and we've started to see this even it's slipping into an arena where even by sharing your opinions, whether right or wrong, the repercussions can be drastic in today's day and age, and it's probably the media. So what my question was, does this culture or this cancel culture, so to speak, affect these trainings on unconscious bias, or does this cancel culture suppress these biases from coming out, and does it build on, or does it go unnoticed and then until it's too late? Have you seen this happen in your day-to-day practices?
I personally, I have, I haven't seen it in our personal company, but I have seen it, through reading articles and case studies that I have seen. Because, just back to employees and even employers, if they don't feel, safe about it, talking about different things, then they won't bring it out. So it's very important that they feel safe and they communicate, and that all comes back to the communication, in my opinion. What do you think, Alvin?
I completely agree with you. Communication is critical, and again, that's something I haven't seen. I haven't personally experienced or seen in the company. Yeah, so definitely, because Varun, your point is about someone expressing a view and getting fired, right? Is it what you're saying?
Well, fired, and I believe, I can't remember the names of the authors, Alvin. I believe it originated from France. In fact, they did a memo, so to speak. It was signed by the who's who in the literacy world, from Salman Rushdie to J.K. Rowling and so on. And this was a statement against this cancel culture, like where even if you have a bias, even if you act out due to a bias, the repercussions of doing so in today's day and age is much more drastic than what it would have been like about 10-15 years ago. Whereas you might have been sent for training, you might have had a chat with your supervisors and so on, but now nothing short of being sent home is acceptable, and it's probably the media, and it's probably the whole political correctness that sort of comes in here. So that was just a question that I wanted to ask, if any of the ladies actually experienced it, or had any thoughts on that, and what kind of an impact that might actually have on organizations and even governments having these trainings and unconscious bias training, cultural sensitivity training, and so on.
Well, as I said, of course, I know that today, and we have seen that, of course, in the news. In the U.S., there's a around having certain types of trainings, but this is in the U.S., of course. But if I take in Europe, it's still possible, and many external consultant and companies are running, trainings and dialogue, related to unconscious bias. However, because bias are, how can I say that? It's a perceptions. It's not.
Right.
It's not a fact. So, and this is where we need to be also careful, is about what you perceive is not what I'm going to perceive. So,
right.
That will be my comment on that. Is, however, I know that there are clear policies on topic related to sexual harassment, for example,
Sure.
when there are clearly evidence on sexual harassment or any other, discriminations.
Right.
But you really need an evidence of those to really do something. So That's what I will say. I hope that I answer your question. So.
Oh yeah, I mean it was one of those things where kind of sit up one day and think, I've always wondered that, and we've had some fantastic conversations even in our the last few sessions, and then we throw in questions, and the whole aspect of this show is to try and ask the kind of questions that may be floating around. And this is a safe space to discuss. Is that is that something of importance? Is that an important conversation to have, and so on. So really appreciate it, Alvin and Dr. Shelley, for shedding your thoughts on that.
You know what? It's
Yeah.
very interesting too, because going back to the training we are talking about, and bias, and there has been research that I have looked at where a company will have this diversity training, and it actually was able to, through the education, was helping their employees to see that they did have bias that they didn't know that they had.
Right.
And then bringing that out into the light, they were able to actually actively deal with it. Because when it's hidden, and say you grew up that way, and that's the way that you lived, sometimes you're not as aware of it. And then
Sure.
then by being educated by a company, and you're in your profession, it brings it out, so you're able to recognize it and deal with it appropriately.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with you. Education is critical. Education is key. Raising awareness on those topics. Making sure that you even you hire external expert on those topics, because the external expert we're working with on so many topics related to disability, related to race. The fact that external expert came in the company to really talk about the history, the reason why the topic is now, and the bad consequences, helped me and helped other colleagues really have another understanding, another view of those topics, instead of only telling people this is not good, is not helpful, but really telling people, first of all, where it comes from, and the subtle, how can I say that, manifestations as well, that sometimes we're even not aware of those racial discrimination. As an example, of course, it's because he really explained, he teaches us, and it helps you to see things differently after that, and to do things differently.
Right.
It is interesting too that the organizations that I have seen that seem to be doing it the right way, it's interesting. There's common, consistent components to addressing bias in the workplace, and I put an acronym with it, believe it or not, because it helps me to remember it. It's EAT.
Right.
It's education first and foremost, awareness, creating an awareness type of culture, and then training. After you do those things, then there's training, and then there's an extra treat, a T, and that's
Right.
treat. How do you treat other people? You
Yes.
treat people like you want to be treated. So it's interesting what's out there.
And it also requires lots of patience. I know that sometimes in my role, we are also, we have a time constraints, but here we are talking about people's behaviors, and those behaviors are learned. As we said, people are not born with that, they are learned. So it's really about the challenges to unlearn, to let them unlearn those behaviors, and be mindful. Being patient is and really actively listen to people, and also understand that they are coming from somewhere, and it's not about it's not about being judgmental. It's not about agreeing with those behaviors. Is about understanding that those people are behaving like this because they're coming from a certain place, coming from a certain education, a certain culture. So just understand that as well. And because sometimes when we're working on this, we're too passionate, and sometimes it's about having a cold look, and put passion just aside to the side at some point and just have a cold look. It's not easy. I'm not saying that it's easy, but the topic of changing people's behavior for of course, for the better performance of the organization, because at the end of the day, bias in the workplace is also about making sure that this is not harmful for the organization. What we do is really enabling an organization to perform better. So so sometimes you just need to be patient, because as I learned one day is not, you're not moving from A to Z, you're moving from A to A1, A2, A3, and then B1, B2, B3, to really make a difference. So, and this is where I am today as well. You know, it is my day-to-day job, but I also know that I need to be patient. You know, in only 1 year or 2 years, I'm not going to fix what took place in, I don't know, 20, 30, 45, 50 years. So it's a journey.
Oh,
absolutely.
Mm-hmm. You know, I love Varun and Alvin, what you said about Alvin talking about active listening. Active listening is such a huge component of what we're talking about, because people who feel like you're listening to them are going to open their hearts, and you know, the kindness and compassion and the combating the bias, you know, that happens. And you know, it's interesting because my first experience with bias was when I was in grade school, and I'll just share with you. And there was a girl that it was an experience with, you know, similarity bias, which we know is a bias when somebody's not exactly like you, right? And I remember there was a girl in my class that, you know, she had a disability, and I remember her sitting on a bench, and everyone was shunning her and calling her names, and I was shocked as a child. And that's why I know that bias is not something that we're born with. That was my first experience. I felt so terrible for her, and I sat with her, and I remember her crying, and I listened to her, I talked to her, and that active listening made a huge difference, not just to her, but to me as well. It impacted me, and it made me very conscious and aware of the bias that was in the world. And from then on out, I made it a mission of mine to you know, combat bias, not just in the workplace, but in my personal life as well.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I have a very difficult question to ask you. You know, we obviously live in a world with a diverse set of individuals and cultures and history and so on. Let's talk about when large amount of people carry a certain bias as a result of a nation's history. We've seen the Black Lives Matter movement bring up some key topics to discuss, and has shed light on several biases that happened as a result of history. And my country is not an exception. I mean, we went through a civil war for over 3 decades, almost 4 decades to be precise. And those biases, I mean, I remember traveling in fear because I was a part of the minority race. I mean, I had friends of various different races, so I didn't feel it. But the fact that we were pulled into the conflict, or the fact that we were in a space where bias was rampant. Even though the war has ended, we can at times feel that maybe the bias isn't gone. And you can see evidence of it just pop up every now and then. And I'm sure that is the case around the world. So when you have bias, you know, at such a large scale, at such a mass scale. And when it starts to bleed into organizations and come into workplaces, schools, and so on, how do you handle that? Like, is there a if you're a parent, maybe we can handle this question in that sense. What would you do if you're a parent, and what would you do if you're a boss or a manager? Is there a way to tackle this?
Yeah.
It's not an easy question. I know that.
Yeah, no, but thank you for asking that question as well. Of
Good
course,
question.
a very good question. Of course, there's a Black Lives Matters that started, of course, in the U.S. and that it's also kind of global. However, I also think that it's important to separate the how can I say that the U.S. history is going to be, and you just mentioned that the U.S. history is going to be different from the history on about minority in Europe, and it's going to be different from Latin America, and Latin America is going to be different from Australia. It's going to be different in APAC, and so handling those discussion, you need to be able to also take into account the nuances and the dynamics of certain countries and certain regions. The conversation on race is in US is one thing, and the conversation in about race in France is going to be different, and in your country, as you just mentioned, is going to. So the idea is really about having that same conversation, even if globally, of course, we will, in my company, for example, we'll have a global conversation on race, but however, it's important to tackle what it means for you, for your country, for your own, context, because it does not mean the same thing. Because you're going to talk about classicism, you're going to talk about colorism, you're going to talk about, social economic background at the end. So there are so many things that will come that are not necessarily linked to what we experience. Of course, the effect of the Black Lives Matter is positively impact the world now. There are many minorities, no matter where they are, that are really able to also express the struggles that they are going through, no matter where they are in the world. As I said, in taking the example of India, I discussed with a friend of mine who were talking about the caste issue in India. It's not the same, it's the exact same topic like in the US, but they also have their struggles. So, and coming back to the workplace is, we are, when we had this, of course, the George Floyd murder, internally, our CEO took an external, stand about the fact that Pfizer is against racism, and we're taking some actions internally related to the topic, and we're planning to have conversations, in every regions, and then in countries. First of all, at the global level, at the New York level, and then we'll have our own conversation in our regions. The idea is to really enable leaders, colleagues, and manager to have courage, and we call it internally having courageous conversation on those topics. What does it mean? What does it mean for offices where for countries where Pfizer have offices? Really enable those countries to have their own discussion on the topic, to avoid bringing internally the struggle and the challenge that we see external, because our culture is really about equity, is about making sure that everyone has the same chances, to thrive in the company. Of course, we are not 100% there, but it's at least we're having that discussion, and it's a journey. So that's what I will share.
It is a journey. I 100% agree, and I love what you just said, Alvin. It actually reminds me of that quote. It's by, I think, Maya Angelou, and she says, "People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they'll never forget the way you made them feel." And Varun, you were asking, with large groups of people, what do you do? And you know what I have found, the common theme is that it seems that people, you know, if it's age discrimination, if it's gender, if it's race, people want to be heard. They want to be heard. And I'm a firm believer that you don't really know what somebody or a race or a culture has been through unless you have walked in their shoes.
Sure.
But they want to be understood, and they want, you know, society to be aware of what they went through, and that is just it's something that we need to do, I think, as a world, as a society, as a nation.
Sure, sure, absolutely. No, I know that we did in this topic mention about personal life choices, and I think we can spend the last 15-20 minutes you know, talking about um, uh, some of the life choices that people make that can sort of collide with their professional life, and I want to start with you know, at the workplace, you know, things like I let's say having a tattoo. We've seen, I mean, in Sri Lanka, we've seen companies becoming more progressive. I mean, they're beginning to understand that that's okay. But still, but a large majority of the places, we are still looking at some sort of a bias that comes with it. And then the topic of the LGBTQ community and your sexual preference, hugely debatable topic. And in Sri Lanka, we're not unfortunately, we're not as progressive, you know, in that sphere. So how do you, uh, I know, Alvin, your area of expertise is also inclusion. Like, how do you tackle your personal choices at the workplace? How do you prevent them from colliding with your professional life, or how can you ensure that your colleagues don't you know, or your colleagues or your bosses don't have a bias against you?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And talking about LGBTQ plus community in particular, thank you for bringing that up, because this is a community, depending on the country in the world, where
Right.
it can be really, really difficult. At the European level, because at the European level we have, you know, groups tackling cross generation, you know, topics. We have groups on, of course, gender diversity, disability. We have a group on really what does inclusive culture means. And then we have ethnicity, culture, and religion, that is quite new as well. And then we
Right.
have LGBTQ plus, definitely. Globally, we have what we call employee resource group, you know, with a sponsor, with chairs, and then with the colleagues around the globe.
Right.
In the beginning, it was not easy, I have to say. However, coming back to education, it was not easy, because people in certain countries, people were asking, why are you bringing that topic in the workplace? We don't see the value of bringing that in the workplace. So it's really explaining to colleagues, to leaders, to managers, why it is important to talk about it in the workplace. First of all, to educate people. First of all, to really let people experience what someone who is from a different, you know, sexual orientation can feel. An example that I like to say that I was taking is, when you're heterosexual, you will come after a weekend, you know, and during lunchtime with your colleagues, you will talk about what you did during your weekend with your husband or your partner and with your children, right? But
Sure.
someone who is from a different sexual orientation might maybe not share, or will hide, or will lie. And my question to those people is, like, imagine yourself lying about your own children. Imagine yourself lying or hiding your entire family.
Yeah.
So this is what those people are doing. They're just not themselves in the workplace. And being not yourself in the workplace, you're not performing very well. So, I mean, in the other hand, what I also believe in is on this concept of corporate activism. You know, um, of course, I'm personally trying to find a balance between being myself, following the company's values,
Sure.
and really trying to mirror our society. And at the end of the day, our societies is composed with all those peoples that you just mentioned, LGBTQ plus, people from cultural, ethnic backgrounds. So we have to take that into account in the workplace. People are not leaving themselves at the door when they arrive in the office, right? They are not arriving in the office and say, okay, I'm leaving this part of myself here at the door and then I'm in. They are coming themselves. So we need to take the their their whole selves, when we are managing them, when we're discussing that with them. So at least related to LGBTQ plus, I have to say that at the European level, and even our company is among the company that are well recognized for really welcoming, colleagues from the LGBTQ community. Of course, I'm
Right.
not going to say that it's in every single country the same. We're struggling in certain countries, but at least the company is really ensuring that those colleagues are welcomed and that they really feel safe internally.
Sure. Yeah.
I love that. And Alvin, I have to commend Pfizer for their work on decreasing bias. I mean, it sounds like they're doing so much for, racial bias and gender bias and age-related bias. And I mean, I don't know. It's interesting because I'm on a mission to
Yes.
decrease bias around me and in the workplace because of things that I personally went through, and they actually are things that I put in my book. And one being, I am actually a foot and ankle surgeon. And when I was going through surgical residency, it was the worst experience for me from a gender bias. I had to work harder and I had to work longer hours than my male counterparts because of because I was a woman. And
Right.
at that point, we talked earlier in the show about being open and having people talk and communicate and being aware through diversity training. There was nothing like that when I was going through training, and I felt angry and I felt lost because I felt like I had no voice. And I think that therein, right there, people not feeling like they have a voice is where, you start having really, really horrible problems in our world.
Yeah, absolutely. And
With
that's
violence and all of that. So
Yeah.
people want to be heard. They want to know that somebody cares.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And especially with the COVID-19 situation, talking about, the place of women now in the healthcare, we clearly see that, they're doing an amazing job. They're really in the front line. Um,
Yes.
so
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
They're our
Absolutely.
heroes, aren't they?
they are, they are.
Yes,
They
really,
very
really,
much
in every
are.
country.
Absolutely. Every country across the board, and it's truly truly fantastic, and I'm glad, like even in such a grim pandemic situation, I mean certain beautiful things are emerging, certain truths emerging, and certain important things in the world being highlighted, and that's I guess the silver lining of this whole experience. And so with that said, I'd like to go ahead and open Pandora's box by talking about two things that a sort of a taboo to even discuss. So I want to ask you, ladies, about religion and the biases that can arise at the workplace as a result of it. We do hear stories about biases against certain religions, and also it doesn't help when the religious faiths of each individual. I mean, they have their own faiths, they have their own beliefs, and they have the freedom to follow whichever religion they want to. So what happens when your faith is strong, but then you have but so is the bias at the workplace. How do you neutralize that? Can you neutralize it? How do you tackle that? And
Uh,
Oh, go ahead, Alvin.
yeah, at least where I have to say that we're still on a journey is also on this topic of religion. As I said, we just created at the European level a specific group on culture, ethnicity, and religion, and I'm glad we're doing that.
Right.
In certain countries, if I take the example of France, for example, there's a clear, separate distinction between what we call is laicity in France. Like, okay, you know, individuals are not, how can I say? It's like we need, religion shouldn't be visible in the workplace,
Right.
in certain public areas. That's the French constitutions, by the way.
Okay.
And of course, we also know that with all the attacks that happened in the past, our colleagues from different and our other French people from
Sure.
different religions are also seen differently. They are really experience bias everywhere.
Yeah.
On the topic of religion and going back, we're also making sure that no matter your beliefs, no matter who you are, you should have the same equal opportunities. But going back on the inclusion point of view, and where we really want us to progress at the European level is when we know that there's a Ramadan. I'm taking the example of Ramadan, for example, when some of our colleagues are observing Ramadan. An example of inclusion will be to at least avoid having certain meetings at a certain times, or avoid inviting, when you're a manager, avoid inviting a team for lunch or for dinner, because you know that those colleagues, first of all, won't be able to come, or if they come, they won't be able to eat or do any single thing. So this is an example of getting educated on the nuances and dynamics on certain religions, so that when you as a manager, you know that you have those colleagues in your team, you're also inclusive to those aspects of their lives, because it matters, it really matters to them. So what we also do in terms of joy, this is something I see more and more colleagues really sharing in our internal communication channels, like wishing others, when there's Ramadan or when there's the end of Ramadan, colleagues will just wish others a nice end of Ramadan. Or even from our colleagues from Indian background, there will be, and even from Chinese, so there will be messages celebrating those colleagues and wishing them best wishes, which is good. It's a start. It's a start, at least to explaining people what's behind Ramadan, because I saw this year internally, a colleague who sent a note, an article to really teach us on what Ramadan means. And in going back to education, I learned from that, and the more we will continue doing that in a very safe environment, in a very with very good intention behind. Of course, this is good, and this is what I personally find useful talking about religion. It's not easy. I agree with you completely. But I clearly see that because the company is, there's a high level of psychological safety. I see colleagues really bringing much more themselves, even on topic related to religions. Again, not in every country. I'm not going to say that it is in every country. In Europe, UK is a good example of that. And in France, we are just starting, because we put that as topics, and we will see. The way I envision it is really about at least celebrating as well with our other colleagues when there's something that is happening in their religion, so that we can at least educate other colleagues on that.
I love that. And in my career as a surgeon, and then going into the production world, I mean, we employees, employers, we really had quite a melting pot of religions with what we did. And you know what, the success for incorporating all of them together in a cohesive manner seems to really revolve around a really cool recipe, and that is, number one is probably awareness. Is everyone being aware of the religions and the beliefs of other people that are around them. And then the other thing is acceptance, is accepting that there are people around you that have different religions. And then the last thing is respect, really respecting those other beliefs that are around you. I mean, it's essential if you're going to be getting along in the workplace.
Oh, absolutely, Shelley. I fully agree with the points shared. So I did talk about a second item, in the Pandora's box, and that's politics. And I think it's a very relevant a topic that must be discussed in today's world. And I've read something really interesting, and it's not really related to workplace, but I think it says a lot. And we've I do relatively follow the U.S. politics, to a certain extent, and we've noticed, even among my friends, I've noticed a distinct difference I think the word is party alliance. It's the lines becoming very, 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 very clear. And I saw some research recently, and I'll just read out the stats. And it said 71% of single Democrats, that's 71%, that's a huge number, would not consider dating someone who has voted for President Donald Trump. And 47% of Republicans and right-leaning respondents, they mentioned that they wouldn't consider dating for someone who voted for Hillary Clinton. And we're seeing this in Sri Lanka, in our political landscape as well, and where sort of politics has become, people are taking a hard line on that, and they're absolutely not willing to work together. And surely this must be
right,
coming into the workplace and must be causing all sort of disruption in terms of bias.
It does, because especially, and I can comment from the America standpoint, is it's heated, Varun. I mean, you're almost afraid and timid to say anything about politics, and whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent, it doesn't matter. One thing that really concerns me with politics, and I will share it with you here in the United States, is that I think that our leaders have lost sight of what they're there for. They're there for the American people, and it's really not about the Democratic Party. It's not about the Republican Party or the Independent Party. It is about the people, and are we struggling? We, in some respects, I'll be honest with you, is we don't feel like we have a voice, because it really has been, you're right, politicized to the point where the people, I think, are getting lost, and that really is a shame. And that in that there is bias. So it's a tough situation. You're right. That's a good one in the Pandora's box for sure.
Alvin, any thoughts on that?
I think the world is polarized, right? No matter where you go now, you will find polarization in a country. There, more and more, there are clearly two camps in countries. The I will maybe say there are pro and cons. There's a pro camp and the cons camp. So, and I'm going back to this listening and active listening. And there's another concept that I really came through, is about extreme listening.
Right.
And it's difficult. It seems like people are not even listening to each other anymore. Really.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to impose his or her view on, and that's why it seems like there's no more debate. People are no more debating. Everyone is really trying to impose his own views and his own thoughts on, and yeah, that's what I will say. Of course.
Yeah.
No, and I mean, jumping off of what you just said, Alvin, it's almost, and I don't know if it's like this in other countries, but here, people are instead of being focused on the present moment and how am I doing right here, let me enjoy my family, let me enjoy my colleagues and my workplace. Instead, there's a tremendous amount of talk about, what happened in the past, and fixated on the past and what happened and the negativity, or, ruminating again about the future. Oh my goodness, what's going to happen in the future? There's tremendous amount of anxiety and tension and, oh God, almost like electricity in the air in a negative sense. So, it's interesting because now I watch the news for a little bit in the day and then I flip it off because I make a focus really to concentrate it on the here and now. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, and
Absolutely. All
and
right. So
in Europe, we also have our own. If you see the news and going back to the news, I mean, media, they're not helping neither because,
yeah, you're right.
Positions, there's no more. I personally like this concept of nuance as well, but I don't see many nuance. I don't see nuance. The conversation are no more nuanced, on TV. I like when you talk about something, when experts are going to say, they will say, okay, this is one thing. However, this is also another thing. But you don't hear that a lot in conversation and on TV debates, TV conversation. So, and I think that's also one of the challenges that nuancing is no more the norm.
absolutely. And I know we've like kind of run out of time, but it'll be a huge disservice if I don't ask this. During this conflict, during this little tug of war that's going on, between political difference and so on, what happens to the objective truth? If you take climate change, for example, there is evidence, there is scientific data backing it, but then you you it's surprising to see that even something that's backed by data being having two sides, and we see that coming in. So yes, you could say bias. You could talk about bias. Then um, is there any weightage given for objective truth in these discussions at the workplace when these trainings are occurring when it comes to unconscious bias?
In my case, at least at the European level, we are working with business psychologists who made researchers. So they are not coming just to train us. They have evidence.
Right.
In every single thing they are saying, there's an evidence. There are researchers behind.
Right.
We have to, it can't be purely subjective, in my opinion. There has to be objective, and I am a firm believer, like you were saying, Alvin, is that there has to be the data behind it, the science behind it, and otherwise, what happens is you lose as an employer if you're presenting that, for example, to your employees in some type of training that you're giving them. If you don't have something substantiated to back it up, where's your credibility?
Yeah.
You have no credibility, and therefore your training is not effective. So I 100% agree with you, Alvin.
Right. Absolutely. All right, ladies, last question for the day, and then we can wrap up, and we are 3 minutes over time. So if there is one takeaway, if there is one tip that you can give our audience or our listeners, what is the one thing that they can do today or should do to avoid falling prey to bias?
I do not mind starting, and for me, the one thing that they can do is educate themselves. And that goes back to the subject we just talked about is, do not rely on the media, do not rely on one digital media source. You have to look at the objective findings and really weigh all of the information before you make an opinion about something. So education, I think, is imperative for individuals, but it is even more imperative for companies who are in charge of a group of employees. So education would be my takeaway.
Got it.
Yeah, there's one book I will recommend, Thinking Fast and Slow, from Daniel
Right.
Kahneman, Kahneman. Thinking Fast and Slow. That's a book
Right.
talking about education that I
And
will
that's
highly recommend.
Oh, thank you, Alvin.
People to
Really,
get
really.
educated on, to understand where our
Mhm.
brain can sometimes bring us. It's not necessarily where we would like to go, but it's really about understanding the way our brains works. And sometimes the brain wants to go fast, but it's not because it's going fast that is the best way, but really and also really actively listen to people.
yes.
Active listening.
Treat people
Nice.
with
Yeah.
kindness, passion, and treating people the way you want to be treated. You can't go wrong with that.
Oh, absolutely, for sure, for sure. Well, with that said, I'm afraid we're out of time and we've come to a close of today's conversation of bias in the workplace when personal life choices collide with your professional life. And a big thank you to our guests, Alvin and Dr. Shelley. Thank you so much for being with us here today. It's been a pleasure. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you
So
very
do stay.
much. Thank you
Yeah,
Thank
very
you.
much. I wake up very early for me, but I thank you. I
Me too.
love just love this. Really, I love this, and those are the kind of jewels that you have in your life, something you do not expect. And thank you. I've just discovered also Dr. Sherry, and I hope we will also stay in contact. Thank you, Varun, and thanks the team behind. Really amazing job.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Personally, I like building bridges across countries, across cultures, across people. And this is another opportunity for me to build bridges. I'm in Paris. We have Dr. Shirley who is in the US. You're in Sri Lanka.
yeah.
Just amazing, really.
It,
Thank you.
it really is amazing. Yes. And Alvin, it's been a pleasure, getting to know you, and Varun, I can't thank you enough. This has been a stimulating conversation.
Oh, the pleasure is ours. Thank you so much, for joining the show and being with us here, despite the time differences and so on. So I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the Luminary team and to our audience who tuned in today. So thank you for joining us. Next week, we have another exciting topic. We'll be talking about office politics and the fine art of sucking up, right? So don't forget to tune in next week. I'm Varun Chandramohan. Thank you for joining us today. See you next Saturday.
Thank you.
Thank you.